let's all be very brief. So I fire 3 brief questions. Jake, we have frameworks on protecting plant genetic resources. We have international organizations to protect ex situ and in situ agriculture, crop diversity, the gene banks, and so on. What needs to change with these institutional mechanisms from a drylands Africa perspective? Victor, what regulatory regimes for the finance sector, which I feel is currently waking up to sustainability but not to resilience yet, what regulatory regimes are you proposing for the central banks, who claim to be all free and independent, and the private banking sector? Kira, I very much buy into the passport idea. Maybe the Vatican, the Holy See, can throw its weight behind that. My question to you is, what's your experience from self-help mechanisms in marginal communities? You mentioned the slums in Dhaka and elsewhere. How can they be strengthened and supported? Thank you.
Yes, Julio.
Excellent presentation. Jake, I think you made a very clear case for simple solutions and low-cost solutions like soil management and water retention. And I think also a clear case of using the creativity of poor people to come up with simple solutions like the plastic bottle irrigation, which is used in many places. My question is how to deliver these practical solutions at a large scale in Africa? What are the institutional challenges and limitations that you have to deliver those practical actions? And for Victor, excellent analysis, very good. I think we have to analyze more and more these connections between the financial system and degradation in the Amazon, and you presented very nice some of these connections. Let me just share that there is a very intense area of debate right now in Brazil about this, and there are a number of investments being made in sustainable agroforestry systems and other systems in the Amazon. And the National Development Bank of Brazil has a call which is open right now, and several people are applying for this blended finance mechanism. And so we can talk more about that later. But my question is about this alliance of the willing that you've mentioned. I'm all in favor of that. And my question to you is what are your thoughts, what are your ideas in moving forward with such alliances?
Thank you for all the 4 excellent presentations, and I will have just a brief question to Kira, because you mentioned proactive, not environmental, but migration, proactive migration, right? And from your research, do you think it is even possible, especially from these isolated territories, from the perspective of the inhabitants? As you mentioned, for example, Marshall Islands. By the way, congratulations if you managed to get there. I'm personally curious how it was possible because I tried several times. It's extremely difficult. But anyways, these people are very, very proud of where they live. And that's my question. From your impressions, from your interview, would they agree to move even if their life is in threat? That's what I would like to know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John?
Thank you. No, again, extremely inspiring. All that we would need hours for debating this, but we will sort of reconsider all these things later on. Now, I have a question to all of you, because I would offer, based on what we heard from Sheikh, from Clara, from everybody, in a way, a definition of sustainability somehow emerging from this workshop. And in my view, it's circularity plus redundancy. And you know, this has to do, and Stefano mentioned this yesterday when I talked about optimal growth. The optimal growth is sort of exponential curve, and optimal means grow and grow and grow forever. But we also have another optimality, namely optimal operation, the highest possible efficiency. And you know this with air traveling in Europe now. A small perturbation in the whole system is collapsing, really, because people want to reduce cost at all costs, so to speak. And the slightest perturbation is just collapsing the system. So instead of having optimal growth, we need something like a circularity, yes? So go, why not in a recurrent economy, but at a certain level. But we also need redundancy, that means, yes, you have to be error-friendly, and if something goes wrong, it goes wrong. But if we operate all the time at this optimality level, then of course we have no resilience. So this is what I would like to offer, and I offer it because I was inspired by Sheikh's presentation in the beginning. As a young man, I was crazy enough to travel through the Sahel and through Africa, hitchhiking actually in 1972, 1973, 1974. So I wouldn't dare to do it again at my age now. But I was actually traveling through the Sahel when there was this mega drought, you know? And we volunteered for the Red Cross and brought flour and sugar and so on. And I was virtually driving through dead cattle at the time, in Niger, in south of Algeria, and so on. And you know it happened because you showed in your first slide how precipitation changed. And we were all lulled into an optimality vision by the ample precipitation in the 1950s and then 1960s. At that time, the Sahel became green. Actually, it had to do, and when we had the mega drought, and you know where it came from, it was because of the aerosols and in the air because of rapid development. So it had so many sulfur in the atmosphere, but first of all, you had more precipitation and then it went down completely. So the Sahel system operated at optimality conditions, so to speak. And when this optimality went away, the whole system collapsed. So if we really want to have sustainable development, we need to accept that we are not 100% efficient. And we need to accept that we will not grow forever, actually. And this type of modesty, and this is what Pope Francis talks all the time about, modesty, so to speak, sobriety, and so on. This is what we need to pursue. My last remark, or my question to Kira would be, but I know the answer, what happened when we offered this passport idea to the German government? And this was a very sobering experience.
Okay, thank you. So let us have a quick response, very quick, to these questions, and then we'll have another round, I hope. So I'll begin with Victor. You have, I think, 2 questions.
I think yeah, here we go. Thank you very much. So I'll be brief. To Joachim, it's a good question. I don't think there will be one global regime in this context. I think the financial sector is just too diverse for it because it includes, you have central banks, financial supervisors, asset managers, insurance companies, stock exchanges. But I think there are a couple of key policy pathways that each of these can progress on. The one is transparency, like with enough reporting on climate risk, nature-related risk. That is a massive, massive obstacle at the moment. The other thing that needs to happen in parallel is actions to reduce systemic risk created by climate and nature-related changes. And I think there are different ways that the insurance sector and, for example, central banks can act on different pathways, but it's possible. Another point, phase out of harming activities. It's very challenging, but needs to be done. We can't just promote financial innovation, you need to phase out. And then the last point on social equity dimensions of financial institutions and investments. I see that missing quite often, even though they're interesting experiments. So it will not be one regulatory regime. I think it will need to be polycentric by necessity because of the diversity, but I think governments can catalyze these actions, and governments are not doing that properly at the moment. Virgilio would be happy to talk to you more about blended finance. There are some unique challenges to that, of course. Alliances of the willing, what does it mean, like in tangible terms? I think we are seeing those alliances happening when it comes to central banks and some governments. I think they're moving quickly. We need to follow that. We would need, in terms of what's missing, an alliance of the willing when it comes to these passive investors that I mentioned and the big three that are growing in influence. And there needs to be an alliance that focuses on their influence on critical parts of the Earth system or the climate system, such as the tipping elements. That would be the Amazon Bora forest, for example. We're not seeing that type of alliance yet for some reasons, but that would have a big impact. I think those are, we call them sleeping financial giants. So they could act in more active ways. And one final to Professor Schellenhuber's discussion here about circularity and redundancy, I would probably also add diversity as a source of resilience and sustainability. Don't forget the impact. Okay, part of redundancy apparently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Kira, you also have 2 questions.
Yes, thank you so much for the questions. So first on the self-help mechanisms, I think in the urban slums, you see extreme creativity to carve out kind of survival niches. One thing that I thought was very helpful was a project that aimed at both current slum dwellers and new arrivals from areas that are climate affected. For example, in Bangladesh, to provide vocational training for both, because it's very difficult once you only provide trainings or aid to one group, especially in areas of urban poverty, you immediately kind of create tension and conflict, conflict of interest, first of all, in this community. So it's good not to solely target new arrivals, but to provide services to everybody who is in need, so to say. But there's reluctance to provide, for example, vocational training, especially to new arrivals. There's more this idea that the more you exclude people, the less people will be inclined to come to these urban areas that are very much at the limit of their capacity. But through my research and other people's research, this is not necessarily true, because people are so desperate when they are fleeing from certain climatic extremes that they will move no matter what, independent of what they will find there. So they are aware that they're kind of engaging in this type of risk exchange. Another aspect is what I think is helping is urban gardening on a very small scale. Of course, we think of maybe Singapore or something when we talk about urban gardening, but I mean really in the slum level to help people grow small scale vegetables. This can really improve nutrition and kind of also help people to save some income that they would need to buy food. So maybe these are two areas. vocational trainings, because people who arrive there from the rural areas, they don't have any skills to have a good life in the urban labor market, because all their knowledge is based on subsistence agriculture often. Some people I have met were illiterate even. So the only thing they can do is very strong physical labor. And often they work in very informal contracts and very dangerous work. Some people are also living in kind of modern type of slavery, exploitation type of schemes. So this is one thing. The question of proactive migration, I think we see all types of migration. We see voluntary immobility. So people, as one quote also said, like, I will stay even if I go under the sea. This is one thing we see. We see involuntary immobility, so people who want to move but cannot afford to move. And people who are kind of waiting to see what is going to happen. If things get worse, they may have to move, just taking it day by day. So I think people will move eventually if they're given the opportunity. Of course, this is a very heated debate in the Pacific Islands, because people think if they sorry, there's kind of echo. If people ask for the ability to move, then they're giving up on the 1.5 degree target. And I think they have to do both. They have to ask to be able to stay by lowering emissions as fast as possible.
Kira, can you be brief, because we have many questions and we don't have time left.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Anyhow, so what happened to the German government? This was tabled last year, and last year before the elections, and it was brought up by the Green Party, this idea of a climate passport, and it was immediately ridiculed by the ruling government. And this then led to the fact that this idea was shut down. Basically, it was seen as an invitation for everybody to move to Germany, which is obviously not the intention of the passport. So it's often misused by some populist parties. But I think if you would approach the government now, government is now differently than it was 2 years ago. So I think maybe now there's a chance that this could be brought up again and have more success in the current government. So a bit more optimistic now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shia.
Thank you, Chair. A few questions, and I will brush very quickly on them because of the sake of time. The issue of gene banks and genetic diversity conservation, a big question, Joachim, you know it. Leverage point number one, let's know better the genetic diversity on those dry lands, not the case. When I say genetic diversity, it's not just the biodiversity, but the content of those products and, what are the virtues of them. Recently, they have discovered in Senegal that balanites has more vitamin E and is more stable as oil than olive oil. And olive oil, you see the potential market of olive oil in the Mediterranean. And such a kind of product exists in balanites, but it's not tapped in. So leverage point number one, knowing what we have. Leverage point number two, trying to use a policy framework, the global ones, the IKI target, the IPBS, but also the bond challenges. And adding to that, in the framework of SDGs, the 30 by 30 initiative, which is by 2030, improving 30% of biodiversity conservation in different countries. That means going beyond national parks, beyond traditional area of conservation. In other words, we need to promote biodiversity ex situ on agroforest landscape and trying to promote those things. And if we add to that the technological part, which is the sequencing, the genetic sequencing, which is quicker now. Genetic sequencing, which used to take weeks or months to happen for one trace, one marker, now happens in few hours. And that gives us the possibility to build libraries of what we know in terms of genetic biodiversity and promote the desirable traits of plants as we promote agroforestry and other products. So just a few pointers for us to reflect on over lunch. The issue of scaling up, very brilliant question from our colleague in Brazil. I'm sure you will face the same problem in there. My quick response is that scaling up would happen when there are two things at least. One, the right governance structure, and second, the investment which goes in. It does not happen out of the blue. It's something which needs to be a deliberate engagement from the policies. What I can tell in an African perspective is that imported solutions catch more attention than domestically grown solutions. And that's something that needs to be reverted. Domestic solutions are effective. It corresponds to aspirations of people, and they can be really cost effective in other words. So, trying to create a mindset of building upon our own resources is a starting point for resilience, just not waiting for people to come with magic solutions or silver bullets. Third, about the last point about circularity versus optimal or suboptimal, my friend add diversity. I'll add multifunctionality. The oversimplification of ecosystem functions has been one of the biggest threats of all the unsustainability we are talking about. If you take a piece of land in Africa, a hectare, my father used to work in the countryside. The hectare of land you have in Africa is a hectare for water, for fuelwood, for agriculture, for livestock, etc. If you come to Europe, that hectare is either for given crop or for livestock. It's never a combination of livelihood in the same piece of land. And multifunctionality is a starting point for equilibria or tending to optimum, the optimum not being seen in the sense of increased growing. I will send you back, John, and we can discuss over lunch. It's more philosophical. The Meadows report, the limits to growth. And I tried to write an opinion piece, which is almost finished. I retitled it, The Limits to Unsustainable Growth, and it goes to your point. So how can we see the ways we can sustainably manage resources without having an economic perspective, as our colleague mentioned? But it's really a deeper issue that can be discussed later, don't have time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Well, I think our time is up, but Joachim, you think we could take 10 minutes? We eat 10 minutes? Okay, so I have 5 people who want to speak. Yeah, I think I'll start with Stefano, and then I'll just call them first, please. Stefano, just a minute. Stefano, just a second. Let me just call and then I will have Robert, who's behind me, Aditi. So, sorry, Robert is here. And Joyce at the back, and Robin at the back. But Robert is in the front. Yeah, Joyce and Robin. All right? So please 1 minute each, 1 minute, so that we can have time for lunch.
Okay, thank you. The point raised by John is very important. That is why today we talk about second best theory. Because they, having followed the optimization, because in reality, it's never optimal. It's a second, we have to aim at the second best. I have a specific question to Victor. You talked about financial sector, you criticized, I totally agree with you. But you know that the present day financial sector did not come from the sky. It was created on purpose at the beginning of the 80s, when derivatives such as CDO, CDS were introduced. Before then, never existed, and still finance exists since millennia. So that is a point which we have to be clear about. Because some people take for granted that financial sector is a natural event. No, it was created for political purposes, and we know what. And to this regard, I'm sure that you know the model by Black, Scholes, and Merton. That is the model which demonstrates that we can cope with uncertainty under the conditions. Now, that model contains a mistake, analytical mistake. And in spite of that, the authors obtained the Nobel Prize in economics, okay? But in America, when the mistake was discovered, the students started contesting them. So it is important to let people know these things, because finance is not a metaphor. 2 days ago, in this same room, we had a seminar that was chaired by Cardinal Turkson about a mensuram bonum, which is a document following up a previous document indicating which the guidelines for so-called ethical investing, in particular in the financial sector. So this is the final version will be ready at the end of this month, so it will be available for everybody. But that is an important idea stemming from the work of the dicastery. Initially was started the dicastery for the human integral development, and now was. And to Clara, again, you talked about the paradigm shift. I totally agree with you, with the necessity of a paradigm in economics. Are you aware of the so-called economy of Francesco project? Because I think that it's part of the endeavor that you are carrying along. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let us move on. Robert?
That's me. I'll be brief. This event is about resilience and what can be done in countries to improve resilience, recognize resilience. But I'm struck by how much of a discussion relates to the obligations that advanced economies, developed countries have to poorer countries to enable migration, to share the carbon budget, to share intellectual property, which is a topic we haven't gone into here, but could perhaps even create intellectual property that benefits people in countries that are in distress. And I wonder if perhaps our leaders might consider a future event in which we specifically reflect on those obligations and how to structure them in a meaningful way. Because I think that the PAS is uniquely positioned to have a strong voice within the international community, specifically on these issues that doesn't exist now, or perhaps exists only in the PAS. That's my 1 minute.
Thank you. Robin? Quickly, please.
Okay. Thank you. I have a comment and a question for Clara with regard to the lessons that we might learn from COVID crisis in order to increase systems resilience and to generalize from that lesson. And I'd suggest that one thing we can learn from the response to COVID is the importance of the long-term investment in fundamental research and the tools to prepare in advance of the crisis. I mean, we saw, I think, reasonably clearly in COVID, one of the successes was in the R&D for new vaccines. The use of those vaccines worldwide is another issue, but the R&D for multiple vaccines was achieved in about 10 months rather than usual 10 years for a new vaccine. And that was because we could capitalize on the investment in fundamental science that we made previously in various ways, in genetic sequencing of pathogens, in platform technologies for RNA viruses, in new methods of clinical evaluation in an emergency. It's all that investment in the underpinning fundamental research. But the thing, applies to a lot of the things we've been talking about, but it's certainly a lesson from COVID, I think. And actually, in the past, it's been difficult to make, in many cases, an economic case for investment in fundamental research. But I think COVID does help us do that now.
Thank you very much. Joyce?
Thank you, Chair. First, I need to say I had the suggestion by Robert, and I really support that suggestion you just made now, Robert. And my first intervention goes to my brother, Mo, and I must say thanks for really reinforcing or re-emphasizing the idea of African problems for African solutions, especially when you talked about local-led interventions and processes that are quite important to adapt and enhance resilience, and also supporting the positive rhetorics about the Sahel, not just focusing on the negative narratives. And, but I want to get your opinion, or I want you to reflect on what do you think are the feasible approaches that can help reduce human capital outflows or resources from these regions to help create jobs for the youth and women in face of these climatic changes in this region. The reason I ask this is because this is not a unique case for the Sahel. It's actually an issue that cuts across most vulnerable regions in Africa and all over the world. The other concern or the other question that I had was to Victor, and what struck me from your presentation is how financial institutions are really fueling environmental degradation. And it was mind-boggling to see how investment flows for deforestation from all over the world to the Amazon, and also the use of GDP as a measure of wealth instead of actually using well-being. I think using well-being as an is actually the ultimate measure of wealth, if you ask me. And you also mentioned that people are not willing to phase out. In fact, in negotiations, they talk about phasing down. They don't want to hear the word phase out. But what I want you what I really wanted to get just your reflections is, do you agree on what Stefano yesterday proposed on sort of an enforcement agency? Because it's almost becoming difficult to get consensus on these things. And probably what Stefano suggested on establishing or creating an agency while environmental organization might really be something feasible. But I just wanted to get your feel about it. Like, what do you think about that? Thanks.